Hey guys, Lolio here. I recently did a video on the best raid bosses in WoW, so I figured I'd do another one and cover the worst raid bosses in WoW. So let's get started.
Patchwerk want to play.
Number 10. Patchwerk. There's a reason that fights with limited mechanics are known as patchwork fights. While it's not quite true that he was a target dummy that fought back, in general it kinda felt that way. His abilities were simply not very engaging or interesting. Patchwerk is the epitome of a gear check boss, a kind of you must be this tall to ride this ride type of encounter. And that may have been okay back in vanilla, when people weren't as skilled or as knowledgeable about the game, but even by the time they reused Patchwerk in Wrath's version of Naxx, it felt pretty old and stale. These days the encounter designers seem to have realized that fights like Patchwerk just aren't acceptable anymore, with even the easiest bosses having much more in-depth abilities.
What happened to Patch?
Number 9. Princess Huhuran. Resistance fights are a relic of vanilla WoW, and much like Patchwerk, they were okay at the time, but looking back, they were actually pretty bad, and none were quite as bad as Huhuran. Most of the time the resistance in these types of fights was necessary and important, but it wasn't the only thing you had to watch out for. There were other abilities or mechanics you had to deal with. But in Huhuran's case, resistance pretty much was the mechanic. Huhuran was terribly difficult if your group didn't have the nature resist gear, which was annoying and tedious and very time consuming to farm, but fell over really easily if you had it. She's also remembered for some really terribly itemized loot drops.
Plus 2 fucking attack power, that's fucking 1/7 of a goddamn DPS point. Thank fucking God! I got the hardest boss in the fucking game to get 2 fucking attack power! Thank fucking God!
Number 8. Shazzrah. Fights these days are often described as being melee unfriendly, meaning that ranged DPS are preferred to melee. Shazzrah is probably the earliest and worst example of this ever happening, where melee DPS players often went AFK for the entire duration of the fight. The main reason for this was the dude constantly cast a spell called Arcane Explosion, which, much like the player version, did a bunch of AoE damage in a 20-yard radius. The damage was high enough that it was basically impossible to keep melee up if they were attacking him, so they'd either sit out or use ranged weapons for most of the fight, which didn't really do much damage. Aside from this, Shazzrah's other main mechanic was just causing a debuff that increased magical damage taken, which essentially meant druids were just decursing everybody through the whole fight. Look, not all vanilla bosses were bad, but Shazzrah embodies some of the worst of that era's design.
You seek to halt an avalanche.
Number 7. Morchok. The first boss of any raid is designed to be pretty easy. I mean, it has to serve as an introduction to the zone. But that doesn't mean the boss has to be boring and uninteresting, and unfortunately, Morchok was. Dragon Soul is commonly thought of as one of the worst raids ever, due to problems like reused models, very basic mechanics, and pretty lackluster spell effects. Morchok has all of these problems. Other first bosses like Magma or Stoneguard had much more mechanical depth, but were still pretty easy, and fights like Jinrock and Immersius were simple, but they had spectacular visuals. Morchok fails on every level, and he's the only boss whose heroic mode is literally just a second version of himself, and even then, the fight was just too easy. Number 6. Shade of Akama. I'm still not quite sure what this fight was trying to be. I guess it's helping Akama battle his inner demons or something, which is somewhat of an interesting fight, but it didn't work as the entire premise for an encounter. Look, Akama's a really cool character. I liked him a lot in Warcraft 3, but fighting off a bunch of ads while he kills a shadow-formed version of himself was just bland and boring. It's a prime example of a filler boss, a fight that's really just there to be easy and provide some loot, without being interesting mechanically or visually. Now, I think bosses like that are actually okay from time to time. They kinda act as a breather, in between hard fights. But to waste Akama like that, and to do it in Black Temple, which was supposed to be the most epic and conclusive raid of the expansion, it just felt really lame.
Allow my champions to fight in place of your knights, Tyrion. We challenge the Horde.
Very well. I will allow it. Fight with honor.
Number 5. Faction Champions. The level of hatred for Trial of the Crusader is right up there with Dragon Soul, and it's not without good reason. All the fights except one take place in the same room, there's no trash, and none of the bosses had any new art. The most polarizing fight in the raid was the Faction Champions fight, where your raid fought several NPCs who actually acted a lot like players. It was kind of like an arena match against mobs, which, unsurprisingly, PvE players didn't enjoy very much. Tanks felt like they couldn't do their job because mobs always dropped aggro, so the fight was very chaotic. While it was certainly different and unique compared to most encounters, it ended up being different in all of the wrong ways.
Soft little fleshy things? Here? Nuisances. Nuisances.
Number 4. Lord Rhyolith. It's pretty rare for a designer to actually admit that a boss sucked, but that's essentially what happened with Rhyolith. I remember an episode of the Convert to Raid podcast where Ian Hazzikostas was talking about various bosses, and he mentioned Rhyolith. He said that the main mechanic of Rhyolith, the driving or steering mechanic where you had to move him around the area, was really cool on paper, but it just didn't work out in practice. And I agree, I think it must have sounded cool while they were designing it, but in the end it didn't work out. Rhyolith is actually one of the few fights on this list that has a unique model and tons of cool spell effects, but the annoyance of steering him around the area just really outweighs any of Rhyolith's positive traits.
Broken.
You must be powerful to have come this far. Yes, you will make worthy test subjects.
Number 3. Amber Shaper Unsock. It's commonly said that vehicle fights just plain suck. Malagos, the Oculus, Flame Leviathan, you get the idea. Losing control of your character for long periods of time just isn't very fun for most people. At least in those fights, you knew when you were going to be in a vehicle, and you generally had a strategy planned out, so you knew what you were going to do. Unfortunately, in Amber Shaper's case, you usually didn't have those things. Turning a random raid member into a mob that's hostile to the raid just wasn't a very good idea. This is actually another fight where Ian Hazzikostas mentioned that the vehicle mechanic didn't work out very well. It probably could have been cool if the raid had been able to actually decide who ended up as the construct, or at least were able to practice it on the trash or something, but instead people were just thrust into a vehicle with pretty counterintuitive abilities, and it actually broke a lot of players' UIs, so a lot of people ended up wiping to the UI boss more than the actual fight.
Forgive me, Empress.
I did not want to have to do this!
Number 2. Lei Shi. Lei Shi is probably the most annoying raid boss ever. The boss actually hides from the players for about a third of the fight. The encounter is really just 3 burn phases, separated by either an obnoxious pushback mechanic, which punishes casters, or the hide phase, which punishes everyone. Combine that with some voice acting that makes Syndragosa sound awesome, and you're looking at one of the worst fights in WoW.
It was so cloudy.
Before we get to number 1, let's cover some dishonorable mentions that didn't quite make the list.
Water is life. It has become a rare commodity here in Outland, a commodity that we alone shall control. We are the Highborn, and the time has come at last for us to retake our rightful place in the world.
Hostile entities detected. Threat assessment protocol active. Primary target engaged. Time minus 30 seconds to re-evaluation.
Your tenacity is admirable, but pointless. You ride into the jaws of the apocalypse.
Number 1. Spine of Deathwing and Madness of Deathwing. The final boss of an expansion should be epic and climactic. The conclusion needs to have that resonating effect. Like the Lich King, Illidan, and to some extent Garrosh, they all had this sense of finality and conclusiveness. Deathwing, despite getting 2 fights, didn't really have that at all. I'm sure that fighting on Deathwing's back must have sounded really awesome in the design meetings, but I have to question whoever actually worked on the mechanics. It's like they thought, dude, we'll have them ride Deathwing and rip off his armor, and then they let the intern decide the details for the fight. Ad fights in general are rarely well received, and you combine that with the super tight DPS check on Heroic Spine's burn phases, and it just wasn't enjoyable on any level. Madness suffers from similar issues. Yeah, seeing Deathwing writhing in the maelstrom and fighting alongside the aspects was an epic moment, but that's about the only positive aspect of it. The actual mechanics made it feel more like you were fighting Deathwing's toenails rather than actually fighting him, and he never even directly attacks you. It's just his blood and tendons and other bodily fluids. It doesn't help that the players end up feeling pretty useless when at the end of the fight, Thrall just turns Deathwing into fairy dust with one blast in the Dragon Soul. I think that the main issue with Deathwing is that we never felt a real personal connection to him, and that's a big part of what made other fights like Arthas so memorable. Deathwing was just a giant, destructive dragon who didn't seem to have any goals other than destroy the world. And I guess maybe that was the point, but that just doesn't make for a very good final boss. In older lore, Deathwing was actually this very cunning, manipulative guy who also happened to be a giant dragon. Blizzard even made a great human-form Deathwing that could have been used as a boss and would have made him more relatable, but for some reason they decided not to use it. The Deathwing fights aren't on this list because they're the absolute worst mechanically or visually, although they are pretty bad. And I'll admit that the concepts of the fights are pretty cool, but what makes these boss encounters just so terrible is the level of disappointment. We're always left with a sense of what could have been, which is how I feel about most of Cataclysm in general. And that's what makes Deathwing number 1. And that about wraps up the list. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Disagree? I'm curious to know what you guys think the worst boss in WoW is. Anyway, that's all from me for now. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe for more, and thanks for watching.